It was a little bit different than the two presentations you've heard, although it builds on them. Particularly, it builds on some of the things that Lionel said, I think, because what I want to try to do is to put the discussion of monetary and financial reform in the context of overall global governance and institutional reform, which, as I see it, is very much what Thierry and the IFRI staff have wanted to do with this meeting. And of course, what we're talking about here is highly political. What Lionel talked about was power and the changing nature of power in the world and how that has to be reflected in governance. I mean, just to repeat something we all know, the contemporary state of governance and the institutions, which are a major but not the only means of achieving governance, are clearly not up to the degree of interdependence that now exists. That point's been made this morning. I would just reiterate it. I would also underline the concept that we're living in a world of mutual vulnerability. And in fact, in both what Pier Carlo and Lionel had to say, that sense of mutual vulnerability is there. I was very interested to hear the Secretary General speak this morning. It was great that he was able to come and to talk about the process of the United Nations and the changes that need to take place in the United Nations to make it more effective, efficient, and so forth. But I think we've got to deal with the world as it is rather than the world as we might like it to be. And I certainly, for one, am skeptical that any reform of the Security Council is coming anytime soon. So therefore, I'm one of those who believe that to try to deal with some of the big issues and the interlocking issues, the interdependence of issues, which again was a theme that came up repeatedly this morning, one needs some form of global steering group. I choose my words carefully, global steering group. I do not say executive committee for a whole set of reasons which we can come back to. Now, of course, as we know, the G20, to be chaired in 3 weeks by our Korean friends, is very much focused on its central mandate of being the premier economic forum. And certainly I know our Korean friends want to make sure it succeeds in doing that. But the reality is already, I would argue, that one can see that the agenda will evolve. And I'm not suggesting at all that this is something that the Koreans should be doing in 3 weeks. But there were even suggestions this morning that perhaps the G20 will end up being G20 finance ministers and G20 leaders will take on other things. Already, our Korean friends have found, and Deputy Minister An can talk to this, that the agenda should be enlarged to deal with development issues for a whole series of very political reasons and good reasons. I would venture to say, because I am less optimistic than some of the things I heard today about the prospects for climate change in Cancun, but climate change, certainly the financial dimensions of dealing with climate change are going to end up on the G20 agenda. Basically, the world needs some form of steering group because a G192, the number of member countries in the UN, simply is not able to do that. Now, I'm aware, although there has not been much talk of this, Jacques, and perhaps it's something we'll do this afternoon, that people can question the legitimacy of the idea of a steering group. They did for the G8, and they will for the G20. But in my judgment, as I say, this is something that can be discussed. The critical thing is going to be whether it's effective or not. If it's effective, people won't question its legitimacy. If it's ineffective, they certainly will. I want to underline again what I said about the idea of a steering group. And what I mean here is that this is not a group that would impose its decisions on anyone. I think that Jean-Claude Trichet was very clear at a number of points in what he said this morning and over lunch to make that point. When you come to something, I mean, let me come back to climate change. While I think there's a need for a steering group, clearly what will happen, or what will have to happen, is an eventual ratification by all members of the United Nations. But this is not in any way inconsistent. The point is that we need a form of leadership in the world which, for all the reasons that Lionel laid out and others I could add, includes the key developing countries. I think he made an absolutely compelling case for that. And also that the kind of issues that they're dealing with are not the issues that are being dealt with in developed countries. Again, I don't need to emphasize that, I don't think, anymore. I was interested to see on this agenda, Mr. Chairman, that we're going to be talking about governance of cyberspace. I also recall having read, I don't know whether anything came out of this, but that Korea was at one point thinking of putting cybersecurity on the agenda for Korea. As far as I know, that didn't happen, but I'm not on the inside anymore, so I'm not sure whether that is true. But I think, and just to make this point very clear, it's been made at other points during the course of the day, the changing nature of the world is reflected in the fact that Korea is chairing this G20, Korea as opposed to one of the G7 or, if you will, the G8. And also, I'm told by people more expert than me that if it had been the G8 that was chairing this meeting again, there never would be the emphasis that there has been on global safety nets on the agenda. That reflects very much where the host countries are coming from. So my argument is that in terms of global governance and the role particularly of summits and leadership of summits, form ends up following function. The G7 finance ministers became the G20. G20 finance ministers became the G20 at Leaders Forum. I've already alluded to how that might develop. And of course, we'll see what comes out of Seoul in this area, but there is no question in my mind at all that France, which will chair both the G20 and the G8, a major dimension of leverage which comes from that, will have a great deal to do in terms of sorting out the bodies. There was a reference or two to the G8 this morning and its uncertain future. With respect to Seoul, and I'll be very quick about this, I think it is very important that we not set for Korea dealing with the exchange rate problem as the test as to whether the Seoul G20 is a success or not. There are other things which the meeting must do, and which really do revolve around the stability and the security of the system. I don't think there's any need for me to go into what came out of the BAL committee. I think that's clear progress in the right direction, although as I say, I don't pretend to expertise in this. Note with interest when the governor of the Bank of England says, if a bank is too big to fail, it's too big. I mean, I understand that in the world that I come from, but I don't really see coming out of the system yet an adequate response as to what's to be done to deal with that problem. I want to say just a word or two about some thoughts I have with respect to the Financial Stability Board and the role that it ought to be playing in the system. I think it's fairly clear that despite all the dangers that exist, there's not going to be a single global regulator. Again, that point has been made during the course of the day. But there can be much more that is done to coordinate, to monitor risk, to capture the evolution of financial innovation, certainly something that hasn't been gone all that well in the past, and to ensure some means of enforcement of principles and standards. The Financial Stability Board, it seems to me, is a key body on which to build, and I hope we'll spend a bit of time talking about that this afternoon. It's going to need more resources, and also, I would argue, its membership should be open to all IMF members. This really isn't the place where you tell people that they're not welcome inside the door. The bottom line I would suggest is that the Financial Stability Board must be able to ring warning bells. I don't know what kind of enforcement is possible. Others in this room probably have better ideas. But it seems to me that that's something that we ought to explore both this afternoon and further on. But I want to close with some thoughts on, for somebody who's come out of the world of foreign policy and in my academic side, a political scientist. Again, this point was made, I think it was by Jean-Claude Trichet this morning, and he just touched on it, and that's the changing nature of sovereignty. Of course, the kind of changes that we're talking about here and the things that I just mentioned do reflect a change in sovereignty. And I would quote, and as you know, Jacques, we've been working very closely with former Finance Minister and Prime Minister Paul Martin, and Paul Martin was the person with Larry Summers that really got the G20 at Finance Ministers level going. He has said that, quote here, coming to grips with what it takes to make globalization work requires a global consensus that cannot be squared any longer with the traditional exercise of sovereignty. The argument that he makes and that I would make is that there are not just sovereign rights in the world, there are sovereign duties. that greater independence, as we know, means greater vulnerability. It's true in the financial area. It's true, obviously, in other areas when one talks about a global commons. And I think that it's possible to argue that the U.S. and European financial players, in the end, in the process over the last couple of years, created toxic assets and sold them around the world. And one can make the argument that that very process is one which infringes on the sovereignty of others. So I would argue that we have to do what probably all of us have been trained not to do and get into this very sensitive area of the future of sovereignty. But that really is what we're talking about if we're going to be able to manage in an effective way the kind of interdependent world in which we now live. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.